The Arizona sun carved shadows across Ezra McKinnon's weathered hands as he gripped the fence post, driving it deep into the unforgiving earth. Each strike of the hammer echoed across his 160 acres like a gunshot in a cathedral, the only sound for miles except the whisper of wind through dry mesquite and the occasional lowing of cattle seeking shade beneath scattered ironwood trees. Nearly a decade of this. All those years of sunrise to sunset routine, of conversations with horses and prayers to empty sky, of building walls between himself and a world that had already taken everything worth protecting. At 44, Ezra moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned that wasted motion was wasted life. His frame carried the lean strength of constant work, shoulders broad beneath a faded cotton shirt that bore the careful patches and mends of someone who made everything last twice as long as it was meant to. The gray threading through his brown hair caught the morning light, and the lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into desert distances and carrying burdens that never grew lighter with time. His hands, scarred from years of ranch work and marked by an old bayonet wound across the left wrist, moved with practiced efficiency, even as his mind wandered territories he usually kept locked away. The Homestead Act papers in his kitchen drawer proclaimed this land his legal property, signed and sealed in 1874 when the world still held promise and possibility. 160 acres of high desert, rocky soil dotted with barrel cactus and palo verde, sparse grass that turned gold in summer and brown in winter, and the most precious commodity in Arizona territory, water. The well he had dug by hand during his first year here reached 40 feet down to an underground spring that had sustained his small herd through droughts that broke lesser men and sent them fleeing back east with tales of a country too harsh for human habitation. But Ezra knew the truth about harsh country. He had learned it at Gettysburg in 1863, serving as a military medic in the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, where he had saved 23 men from bleeding to death in fields carpeted with the bodies and watered with blood. He had learned it again at Antietam, where the creek ran red for 3 days and the screaming of wounded horses haunted his dreams for years afterward. The Arizona desert might be unforgiving, but it was honest in its cruelty. It did not pretend to be something it was not, did not offer false hope or broken promises. It simply demanded that you be strong enough to survive it or honest enough to leave. The routine never varied because variation led to thinking, and thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to places where his long exile's careful discipline could unravel in an instant. Dawn brought coffee black as sin and twice as bitter, brewed in a blue enamel pot that Catherine had chosen from a catalog back when choosing things together had been one of life's simple pleasures. The first cup was always consumed standing at the kitchen window, looking east toward the mountains where the sun painted the sky in shades that reminded him of her hair when it caught firelight on winter evenings. After coffee came the inspection. 12 head of longhorn cattle, each one known by temperament and marking, each one representing investment and hope, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstances. There was Duchess, the lead cow who had never lost a calf and who treated Ezra with the disdainful tolerance of a queen forced to acknowledge a useful servant. Big Jim, the bull whose massive frame and gentle nature made him perfect for a small operation where every animal had to earn its keep. The younger cattle born on this land and marked with a Circle M brand that Catherine had designed, drawing the letters intertwined in a way that looked like a promise of forever. His 3 horses occupied the corral he had built with timber hauled from the Chiricahua Mountains, each log cut and shaped by hand during the first winter when staying busy meant staying sane. Thunder, his old cavalry mount, whose blue roan coat showed white scars from shrapnel at Gettysburg, still carried himself like the warhorse he had been, ears always alert for the sound of bugles that would never come again. Belle, a sorrel mare with a white blaze and gentle eyes, had been Catherine's horse, chosen for her smooth gait and patient nature. Duke, young and strong, and still testing the boundaries of his world, represented the only new life Ezra had allowed himself since the deaths that ended everything. The daily routine continued with fence maintenance, a Sisyphean task in country where frost heaved posts in winter and heat cracked wood in summer, where cattle rubbed against rails and wild animals tested every weakness. Water troughs required constant attention, their wooden staves swelling and shrinking with the seasons, their metal fittings corroding in the alkali dust that coated everything in a fine white film. Harness leather cracked in the dry air and required regular oiling, with Neat's foot oil applied with the same methodical care that had once kept cavalry gear functional through months of hard campaigning. But today, something was different. Today, the silence felt charged with possibility or threat. He could not tell which, like the electric tension that preceded thunderstorms in this country, where rain was precious and lightning was deadly. Thunder had been restless since before dawn, nickering and pacing in the corral with the nervous energy that cavalry training had bred into him, the ability to sense trouble long before human senses could detect it. The discovery came as he worked the eastern fence line, where his property bordered the vast emptiness that stretched toward the Dragoon Mountains 30 miles away. He had been replacing a post weakened by the spring runoff when the marks in the sandy soil caught his attention. Boot prints near his well, but not the kind left by cowboy boots with their high heels and pointed toes, or military-issue footwear with its distinctive square heel pattern. These were moccasins, soft-soled and nearly silent, the kind worn by people who moved through country that belonged to them in ways that no government document could ever convey. Two sets of prints, both unusually large for Apache women, because even at first glance he could tell these were made by women from the length of stride and the way the weight was distributed. One set showed the deep impression of someone carrying significant weight or possessing substantial mass, each step driven into the earth with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the strongest person in any gathering. The other set was lighter but still substantial, with a slight favoring of the left foot that suggested injury or fatigue that had been carried for some time. Most telling of all were the dark spots in the seren near the wellhead, drops that had dried to a rusty brown color that Ezra recognized from his days treating wounded soldiers. Blood. Not much, but enough to paint a picture of desperation and need that he understood from professional experience. Someone had approached his well during the night, someone hurt and running, someone who had taken only what they needed before disappearing back into the desert darkness. He knelt beside the prince, his practiced eye reading the story written in disturbed earth. The impressions were sharp-edged and recent, probably made during the night while he slept the light sleep of someone who had learned that danger often came in darkness. Whoever they were, they had approached from the south, moving carefully but not attempting to hide their tracks, which suggested either desperation or the kind of confidence that came from having nothing left to lose. The blood told its own story. A few drops near the well, more scattered drops leading away toward the south, the spacing suggesting someone walking steadily but favoring an injury. Not arterial bleeding, which would have left a different pattern, but the steady seepage of a wound that needed attention but was not immediately life-threatening. In his medical opinion, someone was hurt badly enough to need help, but not so badly that they could not keep moving. Thunder nickered from the corral, ears pricked forward toward the southern horizon like a compass needle pointing toward magnetic north. The old warhorse had senses sharpened by years of cavalry service, an ability to detect movement or threat long before human eyes could find it among the heat shimmer and dancing mirage that made the desert horizon a constantly shifting canvas of illusion and possibility. Ezra followed his gaze and saw them, two figures moving across the heat shimmer landscape, still perhaps a mile away but approaching with the kind of purpose that suggested they knew exactly where they were headed. Even at that distance, something about their silhouettes seemed wrong. Too tall and too imposing for women, too deliberate in their movement for people who were lost or wandering. The way they moved suggested strength and confidence, but also the careful wariness of those who had learned that the world held more threats than welcome. As they drew closer, details resolved themselves through the dancing heat. Two Apache women, but unlike any he had ever seen or heard described in the stories that circulated through saloons and trading posts. The one in the lead stood tall, as most men he had known, her frame suggesting not just height, but substantial muscle and bone, the kind of physical presence that commanded attention and respect. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and efficient, her head turning constantly to scan the terrain for threats or opportunities. Behind her came another woman, slightly smaller but still imposing, moving with the careful gait of someone fighting exhaustion or pain. Traditional Apache dress marked them clearly, leather shirts decorated with beadwork in patterns that told stories he could not read, long braided hair that caught the sunlight like black silk, the unmistakable bearing of those who belonged to this land in ways that no homestead papers or territorial surveys could ever convey. But their size set them apart from anything in his experience or imagination. As they approached the final few hundred yards, Ezra realized he was looking at women who stood nearly 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to rival his own and hands that looked capable of incredible strength. The lead woman carried herself like a warrior, and even across the distance, he could see the tools of survival: a tomahawk of black obsidian that caught light like volcanic glass, a hunting knife with a blade that had to be 12 inches long, a bow of horn and sinew that required more strength to draw than most men possessed. The second woman moved differently, with the careful gait of someone who understood the human body and its limitations. She carried a medicine bag made from soft deerskin, and around her neck hung what looked like a necklace of animal teeth and carved bone, the traditional markers of an Apache medicine woman. Her left foot showed the careful placement of someone favoring an injury, which explained the blood trail and the slower pace. When they reached the edge of his property line, an invisible boundary marked only by habit and assumption, but recognized by all parties, they stopped. The leader raised her right hand in the universal gesture of peaceful approach, but her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging threats and escape routes with the practiced awarenesses of someone who had survived by trusting nothing and no one completely. "Water," she called out, her voice carrying across the distance between them with surprising gentleness for someone of her imposing stature. It was a deep contralto that held both authority and desperate need, a single word that contained volumes of meaning. Not a demand or a threat, but a request that acknowledged his right to refuse while making clear the cost of that refusal. Ezra found himself studying her face as they approached closer, noting the high cheekbones and strong jaw that spoke of mixed bloodlines common in Apache families, the scar that curved across her left cheek like a crescent moon, silvery white against skin bronzed by constant exposure to desert sun. Her eyes held intelligence and wariness in equal measure, the gaze of someone who had seen too much betrayal to trust easily, but still retained enough hope to ask for help when it was needed. The second woman swayed slightly as they stopped, catching herself before her companion could reach out to steady her. Up close, Ezra could see the telltale signs of severe dehydration: cracked lips that had begun to bleed at the corners, eyes sunken back in their sockets, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of a body pushed beyond its normal limits. Professional instincts honed during years of battlefield medicine kicked in automatically, assessing and cataloging symptoms with the detached efficiency that had once saved lives in field hospitals, where death was always waiting just outside the surgical tent. "Sister sick," the first woman continued, her English clear but marked by the distinctive accent of someone who had learned the language as a necessity rather than a birthright. "3 days walking. Please." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could be crossed or burned, a moment of decision that would change everything regardless of which choice he made. Ezra felt the weight of that decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar pack, the same burden he had carried at Gettysburg when deciding which wounded man to treat first, which life might be saved and which was already beyond hope. Throughout his solitude, he had chosen the safety of distance, the protection of walls, both physical and emotional, that kept the world at arm's length and prevented anyone from getting close enough to matter. Since silence replaced laughter, he had spoken to no one except his animals, trusted no one, allowed no one past the barriers he had constructed around his grief and guilt and desperate need for control over at least one small corner of a universe that seemed determined to take away everything that mattered. But standing here looking at two women who had walked across miles of desert seeking the most basic necessity of life, he heard Catherine's voice again, as clear as the day she died, speaking the words she had whispered with her last breath. "Help others when you can, Ezra. Don't let our deaths make you stop living." Thunder whinnied again from the corral, and this time Ezra caught what the horse had sensed, the distant sound of multiple riders moving fast across hard ground, a dust cloud on the horizon growing larger and closer with each passing minute. These women were not just seeking water, they were running from something, and that something was gaining ground. The realization should have sent him reaching for the Winchester that leaned beside his front door. should have triggered every instinct for self-preservation that his deliberate retreat from the world had cultivated. Instead, he found himself stepping down from the covered porch that Catherine had insisted on, saying a home needed a place where folks could sit and watch the world go by, moving toward the well with its windlass and bucket, toward a choice that would end his isolation forever. "Come on then," he said, his voice rough from disuse, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of silence. "Water's free to those who need it." The relief that crossed the first woman's face was immediately replaced by suspicion, a wariness so deeply ingrained that even desperate need could not completely override it. "You help Apache? White man help Apache women? Why?" It was a fair question, loaded with the weight of history and betrayal, of promises broken and trust destroyed, of a people who had learned that kindness from strangers often came with a price that was revealed only after it was too late to refuse payment. Ezra considered his answer as he worked the windlass, drawing cool water up from the depths of his hand-dug well, the rope running smooth through hands that remembered this task from thousands of repetitions over 8 long years. Why indeed? Because loneliness had finally broken down walls that grief had built? Because some instincts ran deeper than self-preservation and connected him to shared humanity, regardless of race or circumstance? Because a dying woman's words still carried more weight than 8 years of careful isolation and deliberate numbness? Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally, offering the metal dipper to the smaller woman first, following the frontier custom of ladies first that Catherine had taught him during their brief, bright years together. The medicine woman drank like someone who had been 3 days without adequate water, which, judging by their condition and the distance they had obviously traveled, she probably had. She drank deeply but not greedily, with the discipline of someone who understood that too much water too fast could be as dangerous as not enough. When she finished, she passed the dipper to her companion with a look of profound gratitude that needed no translation. The larger woman drank more carefully, never taking her eyes off the approaching dust cloud, never allowing herself to be completely vulnerable, even in her moment of greatest need. When she finished drinking, she set the dipper down with careful precision and studied Ezra's face with the intensity of someone whose survival often depended on reading the truth behind words and gestures. "I am Ayana," she said, pronouncing each syllable with careful precision. "Mean eternal blossom in our tongue. This my sister Sakurai. Means sweet because she heal the sick, make bitter medicine taste better with honey and kind words." The formal introduction carried weight in Apache culture, Ezra knew from his time serving in Arizona Territory during the Indian Wars. Names were not given lightly, and to share a true name with a stranger was an act of trust that acknowledged the possibility of relationship beyond mere transaction. "Ezra McKinnon," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "This is my land, legal and proper under the Homestead Act." "We know," Ayana said simply. "We watch you since you come here. You good man. You hurt, but you good. You help wounded animals. You fix broken fence that cattle might cut themselves. You bury dead things proper, with respect." The words hit him like a physical blow. The realization that his isolation had been an illusion, that these women had been observing his life from a distance for years, witnessing his routines and his grief and his stubborn refusal to surrender to the emptiness that constantly threatened to swallow him whole. "You been watching me? Apache always watch, is how we survive. We see you dig graves for wife and daughter. We see you speak to stones like they can hear. We see you cry when you think no one watching." The dust cloud was close enough now to make out individual riders, 5 men on horseback moving at a steady lope across the desert floor. Even at this distance, Ezra could make out the purposeful formation of men who considered themselves to be on official business, the kind of men who carried authority like a weapon and used it to justify whatever actions they deemed necessary for the greater good as they defined it. "They come for us," Ayana said simply, her voice carrying no fear but a bone-deep weariness that spoke of running and hiding and always looking over her shoulder. Always same story. Something go missing from White Man Ranch? Apache get blamed, Apache must run, or Apache must die. "What did you take?" Ezra asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Nothing, we take nothing ever. Not since Father die and teach us that survival mean being invisible, being nothing white man can point to and say, there is reason for our anger. Her voice carried the bitter knowledge of someone who had learned that innocence was no protection against accusation. We fish in stream that flow through Brennan land 3 days ago. Stream that flow free since grandfather's grandfather time, since before white man come with papers that say water belong to them now. The name Brennan hit Ezra like a physical blow. Thomas Brennan owned the largest spread in the territory, a man who had arrived 5 years ago with Eastern money and political connections, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that turned desert into profit and obstacles into opportunities. Ezra had avoided all contact with his neighbor, but reputation had a way of traveling even to those who sought isolation, carried by the wind and the gossip of traveling merchants and the testimony of broken men who had discovered that Brennan's version of progress left little room for those who stood in its way. The riders were close enough now to make out individual faces, close enough to see the badge that caught sunlight on the chest of the man in the lead. Deputy Marshal, which meant this was official business rather than simple harassment, official business backed by territorial law and federal authority, and the kind of legal machinery that could grind up anyone who stood in its way. But looking at the two women standing beside as well, seeing the mixture of pride and desperation in their bearing, hearing the echo of Catherine's voice in his memory urging him toward action rather than isolation, Ezra realized that some choices were already made before you knew you were making them, written in the kind of character that was forged by hard experience and tested by impossible circumstances. "You can stay," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "Long as you need to." Ayanna studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned that survival often depended on reading the truth behind words, searching for deception or hidden motives or the kind of weakness that might collapse under pressure. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once, a sharp gesture of acceptance that carried the weight of a formal agreement. "We bring trouble to your door, Ezra McKinnon. You sure you want this trouble?" "Trouble's already here," Ezra replied, watching the approaching riders resolve into individuals he could identify. Deputy Marshal William Hayes in the lead, Thomas Brennan beside him on his expensive Arabian stallion, three ranch hands whose hard faces suggested they were accustomed to solving problems with violence when legal means proved insufficient. Question is what kind of man I choose to be when it arrives. The horseman pulled up at the edge of his property, that invisible line marked only by habit and assumption, but recognized by all parties as a boundary that carried legal and moral significance. The man with the badge sat his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to immediate obedience, his hand resting casually on the butt of a Colt revolver that looked well used and carefully maintained. "Ezra McKinnon," Deputy Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law and federal backing. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Hayes. We're tracking these two Apache women for theft of livestock and grain from Mr. Brennan's property. They're wanted for questioning." Ezra stepped forward, placing himself between the lawmen and the women, a gesture that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation from simple law enforcement to something more complex and potentially dangerous. Behind him, he could sense Ayanna and Sakari repositioning themselves, not running but preparing for whatever might come, their movements carrying the fluid readiness of people who had learned to expect betrayal from situations that started with reasonable words and ended with violence. "What theft?" Ezra asked, his voice carrying the steady tone of someone who had faced hostile fire and learned not to show fear to those who might use it against him. Thomas Brennan spurred his horse forward, his face flushed with the kind of anger that came from being denied something he considered rightfully his by divine right and legal authority. He was a man in his early 50s, better dressed than anyone else in the territory, riding a horse that cost more than most homesteaders earned in 3 years, his entire bearing radiating the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone with the power to make it stick. "3 chickens and a 20-pound sack of grain," Brennan declared, his voice pitched to carry moral authority and righteous indignation. "Taken from my property 3 nights past when these two were seen camping near my water source. I've got every legal right to retrieve what's mine and see these thieves answer for their crimes in a court of law." "You see them take it yourself?" Ezra asked, though he was beginning to understand the shape of this accusation and the way it would play out if allowed to proceed without challenge. Brennan's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter, his eyes flicking between Ezra and the two women with the kind of calculation that spoke of a man working through strategies and contingencies. I saw them camping on land adjacent to my property. When I checked my stores the following morning, goods were missing. Logic dictates who was responsible. Logic suggests a lot of possibilities, Ezra countered, his military training providing him with the tactical awareness to recognize that this confrontation was about more than missing chickens and grain. Could have been anyone passing through your land, could have been your own hands helping themselves to supplies, could have been coyotes or bears getting into poorly secured storage areas. The deputy held up a hand before Brennan could respond, his experienced eye recognizing the signs of a situation that could escalate beyond his ability to control if not managed carefully. Mr. McKinnon, I understand your instinct to question details, but we've had multiple complaints about these two women over the past several months. The pattern suggests they move from ranch to ranch, take what they need for survival, then disappear before anyone can prove specific theft. Patterns suggest someone's been using them as convenient explanations for losses that might have nothing to do with them. Ezra shot back, his voice gaining strength and conviction as he spoke. Easy to blame folks who don't have legal representation or political connections to defend themselves. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between combatants, and Ezra saw the moment when this stopped being a simple matter of law enforcement and became something more personal, more dangerous, more likely to end with violence than with justice. Deputy Hayes straightened in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his weapon in a gesture that was meant to be noticed and understood. You protecting them, McKinnon? I'm stating facts, Ezra replied, holding his ground despite the implied threat. They're standing on my property, granted to me, legal and proper under the Homestead Act of 1862. They haven't taken anything from me. What they did or didn't do on someone else's land isn't my immediate concern. Then you won't mind if we take them into custody for questioning and let a territorial judge sort out the details. Ezra felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders, heavier this time because he knew there would be no going back from whatever choice he made, no return to the careful isolation that had protected him from exactly this kind of moral complexity. Behind him, he could sense Ayanna and Sakari waiting, their fate resting in the hands of a man they had known for less than 2 hours but who represented the difference between freedom and whatever justice looked like when Apache women were accused by wealthy white ranchers in territorial courts. I mind, he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their volume suggested. I mind because you're asking me to hand over two people who came to my door asking for water and who got accused of theft based on nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time and belonging to a people that some folks would rather see disappear entirely. Deputy Hayes's expression hardened with the frustration of someone who had expected this to be a simple matter of retrieving stolen property and returning it to its rightful owner. This conversation is heading in a direction that serves nobody's interest, McKinnon. I'm asking you politely to step aside and let us carry out our lawful duties. And if I refuse, then you're interfering with a federal investigation. That makes you complicit in whatever crimes they've committed and liable for prosecution under territorial law. Ezra looked at the 5 men arrayed before him, noting their weapons and their horses and their absolute conviction that might and legal authority were equivalent to moral righteousness. He thought about Catherine and Mary, about all that time choosing emptiness over risk, about 2 women who had walked across impossible distances with nothing but each other, and the hope that somewhere in this vast territory there might be one person willing to choose justice over convenience. The isolation he had so carefully constructed suddenly felt less like protection and more like cowardice, a deliberate retreat from the kind of engagement with the world that gave life meaning and purpose. Throughout his careful numbness, he had told himself that avoiding entanglement with other people's problems was wisdom born of hard experience. Now faced with a choice that would define not just the next few hours, but the kind of man he would be for whatever years remained to him. He understood that some problems were too important to avoid, some stands too necessary to refuse. I'm not refusing your authority, he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that language had power to shape reality. I'm demanding that you meet the same standard of proof you'd require if these accusations were made against anyone else with legal standing and political connections. Show me evidence of actual theft, not assumptions based on proximity and prejudice. The riders exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly in the face of logic and legal precedent they had not expected to encounter from a solitary rancher who had spent 8 years avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation. Brennan looked ready to argue further, his face darkening with the kind of anger that came from being challenged by someone he considered beneath his social and economic standing. But Deputy Hayes proved to have more experience with situations that balanced on the edge between law and violence. He recognized the tactical disadvantages of his position, the way this confrontation was developing beyond his ability to control through simple assertion of authority, the possibility that word of this encounter would spread through the territory in ways that might complicate his future effectiveness. "We'll be back, McKinnon," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of promise rather than threat. "With proper warrants and sufficient evidence, and whatever legal authority it takes to resolve this situation according to territorial law. When we return, you'd best hope you're standing on the right side of justice." They turned their horses and rode away, but slower this time, with less certainty and more calculation, leaving behind a dust cloud that settled slowly in the still desert air. Ezra watched them disappear over the ridge, knowing he had won nothing except time, perhaps a day or two before they returned with documents that would give legal weight to accusations that were currently based on assumption and prejudice. But time was more than these women had possessed when they arrived at his door, and sometimes time was enough to change everything. Behind him, Ayanna spoke softly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and concern that needed no translation. "You not know us 3 hours ago. We could be thieves like they say. We could be killers. We could bring nothing but trouble to your peaceful life. Why you risk everything for strangers?" Ezra turned to look at her, this giant of a woman whose presence somehow made his property feel less empty, less haunted by memories and missed opportunities, less cursed by the silence that had become both protection and prison. He thought about the answer for a long moment, considering all the rational reasons that made sense, and the one emotional reason that mattered more than all the others combined. "Because a wise woman once told me that helping others when you can is what separates living from just surviving," he said finally, his voice rough with emotions he had kept buried for 8 years. "And I reckon I've spent too much time surviving and not nearly enough time living." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of better days, of evenings when this porch had held voices and laughter, instead of just the whisper of wind through empty spaces and the echo of conversations that existed only in memory. For the first time since he'd built walls around his heart, Ezra McKinnon was not alone as darkness prepared to fall across his carefully ordered, meticulously isolated world. But he was no longer safe either, no longer protected by the walls he had built around his heart and his property and his deliberately limited existence. And somehow, despite the uncertainty and danger that choice represented, it felt like the first step back toward being fully alive, toward honoring the memory of those he had loved by choosing to care about those who still lived and needed whatever help he could provide. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and constant above the desert horizon, and for the first time since Catherine and Mary died, Ezra McKinnon felt something other than emptiness when he looked toward the future. The first night inside Ezra's cabin felt like stepping into another world for Ayanna and Sakari. The building itself measured 20 feet by 16, divided into 2 rooms with walls of pine logs that Ezra had cut and hauled himself during that first terrible winter when staying busy meant staying sane. The main room served as kitchen, parlor, and dining area, dominated by a solid oak table that Catherine had chosen from a catalog back when choosing things together had been one of life's simple pleasures. A stone fireplace occupied the far wall, its hearth blackened by countless solitary meals and lonely evenings. Ayanna had to duck her head when she entered through the front door, her imposing frame making the already modest space feel even smaller. Sakari moved more carefully, favoring her injured left foot as she settled into one of the 2 chairs that flanked the table. The contrast was striking. 2 Apache women whose very presence seemed to fill the cabin with a vitality it had not known since Catherine and Mary died, their traditional dress and obvious strength creating an almost surreal juxtaposition against the sparse, carefully maintained interior of a man who had spent those empty years learning to need nothing and no one. Ezra busied himself preparing what food he could spare, opening a precious can of beans and cutting thick slices from a side of bacon he had been saving for winter. His movements around the small kitchen were economical and practiced, the result of years of cooking only for himself, measuring portions carefully because waste meant hardship in country where the nearest store lay 2 days right away. But tonight he found himself doubling portions, adding extra coffee to the pot, sharing supplies that represented security in a land where security was always temporary. The silence that had been his constant companion since sorrow claimed him felt different with other people in the room. Instead of the hollow emptiness that usually surrounded him like armor against feeling, this quiet held potential, the possibility of conversation and connection that both terrified and attracted him. He caught himself stealing glances at his guests, noting the way Ayana's eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential weapons with the professional awareness of someone who had learned that survival often depended on being prepared for betrayal. Sakari, despite her obvious exhaustion and the pain she was trying to hide, moved with the careful precision of someone trained in traditional healing arts. Her hands, large but surprisingly graceful, sorted through the contents of her medicine bag with the methodical care of a professional examining tools of trade. Around her neck hung a necklace of carved bone and animal teeth that marked her status as a medicine woman, and when she looked up to catch Ezra watching her, her smile held the warmth of someone accustomed to easing others' pain. "You want to know about us?" Ayana said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they entered the cabin. It was not a question, but a statement, an acknowledgement that curiosity was natural when strangers suddenly occupied space that had been private for so long. "You risk much for people you not know. Is right you should understand what kind of people we are." Ezra paused in his preparation of their simple meal, recognizing an offer of trust that came rarely and should not be taken lightly. In Apache culture he knew from his military service, sharing personal history was not done casually, but represented a deliberate choice to create bonds that transcended mere temporary alliance. "Only if you want to tell it," he said carefully. "Man's past is his own business unless he chooses to make it otherwise." "Our father was Chief Standing Bear," Ayana began, settling back in her chair with the deliberate care of someone whose size required constant attention to furniture that was built for smaller people. "He stand 2 meters 10 in white man measure, bigger than any Apache anyone remember. Our mother, Bright Moon, also tall woman, 1 meter 80, strong like mountain oak tree." She paused to sip the coffee Ezra had provided, her large hands making the metal cup look fragile as porcelain. When she continued, her voice carried the formal cadence of someone reciting tribal history, facts preserved exactly as they had been passed down through generations of storytelling. "Is rare thing in our people this size. Come maybe once in many generations, like white buffalo or double rainbow. Make us strong, but also make us targets. White men see us and think dangerous. Apache see us and think chosen by spirits. Either way, we not allowed to be just women living quiet lives." Sakari picked up the narrative, her voice softer than her sister's, but carrying equal weight of memory and loss. "Father teach us that great size bring great responsibility. Say we must use strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Must be guardians of the old ways when new ways try to destroy everything our people built over many lifetimes." The sisters exchanged a look that contained years of shared experience and understanding, the kind of wordless communication that developed between people who had faced impossible odds together and survived by trusting each other completely. Ezra recognized that bond from his cavalry days, when men learned to read each other's thoughts in the space between heartbeats because hesitation meant death. "What happened to your parents?" he asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the way their expressions darkened and their hands unconsciously moved toward weapons that were never far from reach. 1876, Ayana said simply, the date carrying weight like a gravestone inscription. "White settlers come to Dragoon Mountains. Say they have papers from government in Washington that give them right to land where our family lived for 10 generations. Father tried to negotiate, try to find a way for all people to share water and grazing like has always been done. Her voice grew harder as she continued, the careful English giving way to the rhythms of someone translating thoughts that originated in a different language, a different way of understanding the relationship between people and land, and the responsibilities that came with both. But these men not want to share. They want Apache gone, all Apache, so they can tell themselves they not stealing land that already belonged to someone else. They organize vigilante group, call themselves Citizens Committee for Public Safety, make themselves sound like law instead of what they really are. Killers who wrap murder in flag and call it patriotism. Ezra felt his stomach tighten with recognition and growing dread. He had heard similar stories during his military service, had seen the aftermath of vigilante actions that were justified by appeals to civilization and progress, and the manifest destiny that supposedly gave white Americans the right to take whatever they wanted from people who could not defend themselves effectively against superior numbers and firepower. They come at dawn, Sakari continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as she forced herself through memories that still carried the power to wound. 20 men with rifles and torches and hearts full of hate. Father, try to talk, try to make them understand we want no fight, but they not come to listen. They come to kill. The cabin fell silent except for the soft crackling of wood in the fireplace and the distant sound of wind moving through the mesquite outside. Ezra found himself holding his breath, recognizing the moment when a story moved from tragedy into something darker and more personal. Father fight like bear protecting cubs, Ayana said, her voice carrying pride mixed with grief. Kill 3 men before bullets bring him down. Mother fight beside him, knife in each hand, singing death song like warrior she always was inside. But 20 against 2, even 2 as strong as our parents, the numbers make end certain from beginning. We hide in root cellar, father dig for storing winter food, Sakari added, tears running silently down her cheeks as she spoke. We 17 and 21 then, still young enough to believe world have room for justice, that good people eventually defeat bad people if they just fight hard enough. Father order us stay hidden, no matter what we hear, no matter how much we want to help. His last words to us, live, Sububaum, remember. Ezra felt his own eyes burning with unshed tears as he listened to their story, recognizing in their loss something that echoed his own grief while being infinitely worse because their parents had died violently, murdered for the crime of existing in a place that other people wanted to claim. His Catherine and Mary had blushed of illness, a tragedy, but not a deliberate cruelty inflicted by human malice and greed. After vigilantes burn everything and ride away laughing about cleaning up one more nest of savages, we bury our parents proper according to Apache custom, Ayana continued. Then we disappear into mountains, into places white men cannot follow because they not know land like we know it. For 6 years we live invisible, taking only what we need to survive, helping other Apache families when we can, but always moving, always hiding, always watching for next group of men who decide we too dangerous to let live. The story explains so much about their wariness, their instant readiness for flight or fight, the way they had approached his property with the careful assessment of people who had learned that survival often depended on being able to disappear at a moment's notice. It also explained the mixture of hope and suspicion with which they had greeted his offer of help. The difficulty of trusting anyone after experiencing the kind of betrayal that destroyed not just individual lives, but entire ways of being in the world, is why we know you 8 years, Sakari said, offering what might have been meant as reassurance but felt more like revelation of how completely his isolation had been an illusion. We watch all white settlers in this area, learn who might be friend, who's certainly enemy, who might be left alone if we stay invisible enough. You've been watching me specifically? Ezra asked, not sure whether to feel violated or oddly comforted by the idea that his grief had been witnessed, that someone had seen his attempts to honor Catherine and Mary's memory even when he thought he was completely alone. Apache always watch, Ayana replied, with something that might have been gentleness, is how we survive in world that want us gone. We see you dig graves for wife and daughter with your own hands. See you speak to their stones like they can still hear your words. We see you cry when you think no one watching. See you work until hands bleed rather than sit still and remember too much. The words hit him like a physical blow. The realization that his most private moments of grief had been observed by strangers who had chosen not to intrude but had nevertheless been present during his darkest hours. It should have felt like violation, but instead he found himself oddly grateful that someone had witnessed his love for Catherine and Mary, that his devotion had been seen and understood even by people who had no obligation to care about his loss. You good man, Zachary added quietly. Hurt, but good. You help wounded animals. You fix fence that cattle might cut themselves on. You bury dead things proper, with respect for life they once had. Not many white men take such care with things that bring them no profit. For Ezra could respond to this unexpected testimony to character he had not known was being evaluated. The soft nicker of horses outside warned them that their temporary sanctuary was about to be interrupted. Thunder's warning call was followed immediately by the more urgent alarm of Belle and Duke, all three animals responding to something that had triggered their instincts for danger. Ezra moved to the window with the fluid efficiency of someone whose military training had never completely faded, peering through glass that Catherine had insisted on, despite the expense, because she said a home needed windows for both light and hope. What he saw outside made his blood run cold with recognition and growing dread. Dr. Samuel Morrison sat his horse at the edge of the property line, his medical bag prominent on his saddle, and his entire bearing radiating the kind of urgent purpose that suggested life or death situations. But something about his posture, the way he kept looking over his shoulder toward the distant lights of town, suggested that this was not a medical emergency, but something more complicated and potentially dangerous. It's the doctor, Ezra said quietly, his hand automatically checking the colt at his hip. Riding alone, which isn't like him after dark unless someone's dying. Ayanna was already moving, her hand finding the obsidian tomahawk that never left her side, her entire body shifting into the fluid readiness of someone prepared for violence. Could be trap. Could be they send him to get close, then others follow. Could be, Ezra agreed, studying the older man's behavior for signs of deception or coercion. But Morrison's a good man, far as I know. Been treating folks in this territory for 15 years. Never heard anyone speak ill of his character or his medicine. Dr. Samuel Morrison was 52 years old, a man whose weathered face and careful hands spoke of decades spent treating everything from gunshot wounds to childhood fevers in a land where medical help was often the difference between life and death. He had arrived in Arizona territory during the early days of settlement, drawn by the combination of adventure and genuine desire to help people who had no other access to trained medical care. Ezra made his decision and stepped onto the porch, keeping his hands visible but ready, his voice carrying across the distance between them with careful neutrality. Evening, Doc. Little late for house calls, isn't it? Morrison dismounted slowly, his movements careful in a way that suggested either injury or extreme caution about being seen or heard. When he spoke, his voice carried the urgency of someone with important information and limited time to share it. McKinnon, I need to speak with you privately. It's about those Apache women and the accusations Brennan's been making. He paused, glancing toward the cabin windows where lamplight revealed the silhouettes of his guests. What I have to say could save their lives, but it could also put all three of you in more danger than you're already facing. The words carried weight that went beyond simple legal troubles or territorial jurisdiction. This was about something more fundamental, more dangerous, something that touched on the kind of systemic corruption that could destroy innocent lives and bend law enforcement to serve private interests rather than public justice. Ezra gestured toward the porch, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Come on up, Doc. If what you have to say concerns them, they've got a right to hear it. Morrison approached slowly, his medical bag clutched in hands that showed the slight tremor of someone operating under extreme stress. When he reached the porch steps, he paused and looked directly at Ezra with the kind of intensity that suggested lives hung in the balance of what he was about to reveal. McKinnon, I examined the evidence Brennan claims proves theft. The items he says were taken from his property. Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make his words more dangerous than they already were. I'm telling you as a medical man trained in scientific observation, those items were never stolen. They were planted. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, carrying implications that reach far beyond simple false accusations into territory that involved conspiracy and deliberate perversion of justice for personal gain. Ezra felt his world shift again, the careful balance he had been trying to maintain between involvement and isolation suddenly tilting towards something that would require action rather than passive resistance. "How do you know?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Because I sold the cloth used to patch that shirt to Marcus Chen 2 months ago. Distinctive pattern, special order from back east that I bought for my wife, but she decided she didn't like. Chen wanted it for his workers' clothing, said the fabric would hold up better than what they'd been using." Morrison reached into his medical bag and pulled out a small notebook, the kind he used to record patient information and treatment notes. His hands shook slightly as he opened it to a page covered with careful handwriting that documented his findings with scientific precision. "The cooking pot has a maker's mark from the Santa Fe, distinctive stamp that I recognize because my wife has the matching set. We bought ours last year from a traveling merchant who said only a dozen families in the territory had purchased the complete collection. Brennan never bought from that merchant. I would have heard about it because news like that travels fast in a territory this small." The implications were staggering. If Morrison was correct, then Brennan had not only made false accusations but had gone to the trouble of gathering evidence to support those accusations, creating a case that would stand up in territorial court and result in consequences that could range from imprisonment to execution for two women whose only crime was existing in a place where their presence was inconvenient. "There's more," Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, as if sharing this information was somehow lifting a burden he had been carrying alone. "The dried meat Brennan claims was stolen as antelope jerky, but these women were seen fishing, not hunting. Where would Apache women traveling on foot get antelope meat? And why would they carry jerky when fresh fish would be easier to preserve and more nutritious?" Ayanna had moved to the doorway, her imposing frame filling the entrance, as she listened to Morrison's testimony with the focused attention of someone whose life might depend on understanding every detail of what was being revealed. When the doctor finished speaking, she stepped onto the porch with the fluid grace that marked all her movements. "You risk much telling us this," she said simply, her voice carrying gratitude mixed with suspicion. "Why you help Apache women you never meet before?" Morrison looked up at her, and Ezra saw something change in the older man's expression, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended racial boundaries and cultural differences. "Because I took an oath to first do no harm, and staying silent while innocent people are destroyed by lies would violate everything I've spent my career trying to uphold." But there was more to it than professional ethics, Ezra realized as he studied the doctor's face. This was personal for Morrison in ways that went beyond simple moral outrage at injustice. The tremor in his hands, the way he kept looking toward town, the urgency in his voice all suggested someone who had been forced to make impossible choices and was trying to find a way to live with the consequences. "Doc," Ezra said gently, recognizing the signs of a man carrying guilt that was eating him alive from the inside, "what else do you know about this situation?" Morrison's composure cracked slightly, revealing the anguish beneath his professional calm. "Brennan's been doing this for 2 years, McKinnon, using false accusations to drive Apache families away from water sources he wants to control. Each time, the families disappear rather than face territorial courts that won't believe Apache testimony over white rancher accusations. The confession hung between them like a bridge that had to be crossed or burned, representing the moment when this stopped being about simple legal troubles and became about something much larger and more dangerous. Morrison was not just revealing corruption, he was admitting to knowledge of systematic persecution that had been allowed to continue because good people had chosen silence over action. "How many families?" Sakari asked from the doorway, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone hearing confirmation of suspicions that had been growing for years. "5 that I know of for certain, maybe more that I never heard about because they were smart enough to run before accusations became formal charges." Morrison's voice broke slightly as he spoke. Entire families who had been living peacefully for generations, suddenly accused of theft or trespassing or threatening behavior. Always the same pattern, accusations based on proximity rather than evidence, territorial courts that assume guilt rather than innocence, and families who chose exile over execution. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a physical presence, transforming their situation from a simple legal dispute into something that touched on fundamental questions of justice and human dignity. Ezra found himself thinking about his own military service, about oaths taken to defend justice and protect the innocent, about the gap between ideals and reality that seemed to grow wider with each passing year. "Why now?" Ayanna asked, her tactical mind already working through the implications of Morrison's revelations. "Why you tell us this tonight instead of staying silent like you have for 2 years?" Morrison straightened his shoulders, and for a moment Ezra saw the young man who had once believed that medicine could heal not just bodies but societies, that individual acts of courage could make a difference in a world that seemed determined to reward cruelty and punish compassion. "Because this time is different," Morrison said quietly. "This time Brennan's not just trying to drive you away from water sources. He's trying to control the three most important water sources in the territory, including the spring on McKinnon's land. If he succeeds, he'll have the power to determine who survives and who doesn't for hundreds of square miles." The economic and political implications were staggering. In desert country, water was more valuable than gold, more important than oil, more essential than any other resource because everything else depended on it. A man who controlled water controlled life itself, holding power over entire communities and determining the fate of anyone who dared to challenge his authority. "Your land is the key," Morrison continued, looking directly at Ezra. "The spring on your property feeds into the underground system that supplies water to two other major sources in the area. If Brennan can force you off your land through legal means or intimidation, he'll control the entire watershed." Ezra felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, revealing a picture that was both more complex and more dangerous than simple theft accusations. This was about empire building on a scale that reached beyond individual greed into systematic control of the resources that made life possible in Arizona territory. But understanding the scope of the problem also revealed potential solutions, strategies that might turn Brennan's own methods against him and expose the corruption that had been allowed to flourish in darkness. Military training that had been dormant for years began to reassert itself. Tactical thinking that approached problems from multiple angles and looked for weaknesses in seemingly impregnable positions. "Doc," Ezra said slowly, his mind already working through possibilities and contingencies, "would you be willing to testify about what you've told us here tonight? In court, under oath, where lying would mean perjury charges and professional disgrace." Morrison's hands stopped trembling as he considered the question, and when he answered, his voice carried the firm resolution of someone who had finally chosen courage over comfort. "Yes, God help me, yes. I should have done it 2 years ago when this started, but I was afraid of losing my practice, afraid of what Brennan's political connections could do to my reputation and my livelihood. And now I'm more afraid of what happens to my soul if I keep letting innocent people suffer because I'm too cowardly to stand up for what's right." The transformation was remarkable to witness, the moment when fear gave way to determination, and Morrison stepped across the line that separated passive observers from active participants in the struggle for justice. Ezra recognized that moment from his own military experience, the instant when soldiers stopped being individuals concerned primarily with personal survival and became part of something larger than themselves. But before anyone could respond to Morrison's commitment, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the desert night, multiple riders moving at speed toward the cabin. This time there was no advance warning from thunder, no gradual awareness of approaching threat. This was the sudden appearance of danger that had already closed to striking distance before anyone realized it was coming. "Riders," Ayanna said unnecessarily, her hand already finding her tomahawk as she moved to position herself between the approaching threat and her sister. "Many horses, moving fast." Through the darkness, they could make out the shapes of at least 8 horsemen, more than the 5 who had come that afternoon, approaching in a formation that suggested military organization rather than casual law enforcement. These were not men coming to ask questions or serve warrants. These were men coming to take what they wanted by whatever means proved necessary. "It's Sheriff Crawford from Tucson," Morrison said, his voice tight with recognition and growing fear. Brennan must have sent word to bring in territorial authority to override any local complications. The implications were clear and terrifying. Sheriff Crawford carried legal authority that transcended local jurisdiction, backed by territorial law and federal power. If he had come this far, with this many men, it meant that simple resistance was no longer an option and that legal technicalities were about to give way to force applied with the sanction of official authority. But as Ezra watched the approaching riders, noting their formation and the purposeful way they moved through the darkness, he realized that something had fundamentally changed in his own thinking. His long isolation had ended not just in fact, but in spirit, replaced by a commitment to justice that made surrender impossible, regardless of the odds or consequences. The boy who had enlisted in the Union Army was still alive somewhere inside the man who had spent those empty years trying to forget that such ideals existed. And as Sheriff Crawford and his men drew closer to the cabin, where two Apache women waited to learn whether the law would protect them or destroy them, Ezra McKinnon felt that younger, more hopeful version of himself stirring back to life. The approaching horses carried with them the weight of decision and the promise of conflict, but they also carried the possibility of redemption for a man who had been given an unexpected opportunity to stand for something more important than his own carefully constructed safety. In the distance, thunder rolled across the desert sky, and for the first time since abandoning human connection, Ezra McKinnon was eager to see what the storm might bring. The 8 riders materialized from the desert darkness like specters of judgment, their horses' hooves drumming against hard ground with the rhythm of an approaching storm. Sheriff Crawford led them in a tight formation that spoke of military precision rather than casual law enforcement, his badge catching starlight as he sat his mount with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. Behind him rode Deputy Hayes and Thomas Brennan, but the other 5 men were strangers whose hard faces and professional bearings suggested they were accustomed to solving problems that ordinary legal processes could not handle. Ezra stepped down from the porch with deliberate calm, his hand resting near but not on his Colt, his military training providing him with the tactical awareness to recognize that this confrontation would be won or lost based on preparation and nerve rather than speed with a gun. Behind him, Ayanna moved to position herself where she could see all approaches to the cabin while keeping Sakari within protective reach, her imposing frame radiating controlled menace that made even hardened men think twice about direct confrontation. Dr. Morrison remained on the porch, his medical bag clutched in hands that no longer trembled, his earlier fear replaced by the grim determination of someone who had finally chosen sides and intended to see his decision through regardless of personal cost. The transformation in the older man was remarkable to witness, years of accumulated guilt and professional compromise crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous than mere moral outrage. "McKinnon!" Sheriff Crawford called out as his group reached the invisible property line that had become the boundary between law and justice, between official authority and individual conscience. His voice carried the weight of territorial jurisdiction backed by federal power, but underneath the formal tone lay something harder and more personal, the frustration of a man whose carefully laid plans were being complicated by stubborn resistance from an unexpected source. Crawford himself was a man in his late 40s who had built his career by understanding which way political winds were blowing and adjusting his enforcement priorities accordingly. He possessed the kind of flexible morality that allowed him to serve justice when it was convenient and ignore it when more powerful interests demanded different outcomes. But tonight his usual confidence seemed strained, suggesting that whatever instructions he had received from Brennan carried complications that even his considerable experience had not prepared him to handle. "Sheriff," Ezra replied with careful neutrality, noting the way the other riders had spread out slightly to create crossfire angles that would make retreat or resistance extremely difficult. These were not local ranchers or territorial deputies, but professionals whose presence suggested that someone with serious resources had decided this situation required final resolution rather than continued negotiation. "I'm here on official territorial business regarding 2 Apache women wanted for theft and conspiracy," Crawford announced, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. "I have warrants signed by Judge Harrison in Tucson authorizing their immediate arrest and transportation for trial." The papers looked official enough in the lamplight that spilled from the cabin windows, complete with territorial seals and judicial signatures that would satisfy any reasonable challenge to their authenticity. But Ezra noticed the way Crawford held them, too carefully and at an angle that prevented close examination, suggesting that closer scrutiny might reveal irregularities that would not bear legal scrutiny. "May I examine those warrants?" Morrison asked, stepping forward with the professional authority that came from decades of dealing with legal documents related to medical practice and territorial health regulations. His request carried weight because physicians routinely dealt with courts and judges in matters involving mental competency, death certificates, and expert testimony. Crawford's hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for everyone present to notice the slight uncertainty that flickered across his features before his official demeanor reasserted itself. "These are legal documents issued by proper territorial authority, Doctor. Your medical expertise doesn't extend to judicial matters." "Perhaps not," Morrison replied calmly, "but my experience with territorial paperwork is extensive, and I've learned to recognize authentic documents from ones that might have been prepared hastily or under irregular circumstances." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke, transforming what had been a simple matter of law enforcement into something more complex and potentially dangerous. Crawford's jaw tightened with the frustration of someone whose authority was being questioned by people who should have known better than to interfere with official business. But his next words revealed the depth of his commitment to seeing this situation resolved according to Brennan's specifications. "Morrison, I'm surprised to find you here interfering with territorial law enforcement," Crawford said, his voice carrying a subtle threat that anyone with political experience would recognize immediately. "A man in your position should understand the importance of supporting established authority rather than encouraging resistance to legal process." But Morrison had already crossed the line that separated comfortable compliance from dangerous integrity, and his response carried the quiet strength of someone who had finally chosen principle over pragmatism. "Sheriff, I'm here as a medical professional who has examined evidence related to these charges and found significant irregularities that call into question the entire basis for this arrest." The words struck the assembled lawmen like a physical blow, transforming their confident assumption of easy resolution into something far more complicated and potentially embarrassing. If a respected physician was prepared to testify that evidence had been fabricated or planted, it would call into question not just these specific charges, but the competence and honesty of everyone involved in bringing them. Brennan urged his horse forward, his face flushed with the kind of anger that came from seeing carefully laid plans threatened by unexpected complications. "Morrison, you're interfering with recovery of stolen property and harboring of known criminals. I strongly advise you to reconsider your involvement in this matter before you find yourself facing charges as an accessory." The threat was delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and economic pressure. But Morrison's response revealed how completely the doctor's perspective had shifted during his conversation with Ezra and the Apache women. "Mr. Brennan, I've examined the items you claim were stolen," Morrison said clearly, his voice carrying across the distance between them with scientific precision. "The shirt you presented as evidence contains fabric I sold to Marcus Chen for his workers' clothing 2 months ago. The cooking pot bears maker's marks that identify it as part of a limited series sold only to specific customers, none of whom were you. The meat jerky is antelope, obtained through hunting that these women could not have accomplished while traveling on foot without weapons suitable for large game." The silence that followed Morrison's testimony was broken only by the snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through mesquite, but the implications of his words created a tension that made the very air feel charged with possibility. Crawford's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing uncertainty about how to proceed when the foundation of his legal authority was being systematically undermined by expert testimony from an unimpeachable source. "Doctor," Crawford said slowly, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to salvage a deteriorating situation, "those are serious accusations you're making. Are you prepared to swear under oath that evidence has been deliberately falsified?" "I am," Morrison replied without hesitation, his commitment absolute and unwavering. "I'm prepared to testify in any court that will hear the truth about what's been happening to Apache families in this territory for the past 2 years." The revelation hit the assembled riders like an explosion, transforming what had been a simple matter of arresting suspected thieves into something that touched on systematic corruption and abuse of legal authority. Crawford exchanged glances with his men, his calculating mind working through the political ramifications of proceeding with arrests that might not survive legal scrutiny and could potentially expose patterns of behavior that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. But before anyone could respond to Morrison's devastating testimony, Ayanna stepped forward into the lamplight, her imposing frame casting shadows that seemed to dwarf even the mounted men who had come to arrest her. When she spoke, her voice carried the formal cadence of someone delivering testimony that had been carefully considered and precisely worded. I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Standing Bear, granddaughter of Chief Cochise, keeper of the old stories and guardian of the sacred places, she said, her English clear and precise, despite the Apache accent that marked her words. I speak truth before all these witnesses, white and Apache, that my sister and I have taken nothing from Thomas Brennan or any other white man. We fish in streams that flow free since time before memory. We gather plants that grow wild for all people. We drink from springs that belong to Earth Mother, not to papers white men make to claim ownership of what cannot be owned. The formal declaration carried weight that transcended legal technicalities, invoking cultural and spiritual authorities that predated territorial jurisdiction by centuries. But more than that, it represented a direct challenge to the assumptions underlying the entire system of land ownership and resource control that men like Brennan used to justify their accumulation of power and wealth. Crawford's response revealed the depth of his frustration and the pressure he was under to resolve the situation according to specifications that came from sources more powerful than mere territorial law. Miss, your cultural beliefs don't override legal reality. Mr. Brennan owns that land and the water on it according to properly filed claims and territorial law. Fishing on private property without permission constitutes theft regardless of your personal beliefs about water rights. Then your law is wrong, Sakari said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the pain she was still carrying from her injured foot, her voice carried the absolute conviction of someone who understood truth at a level that transcended human legislation. Water flow where Earth Mother send it, not where white man papers say it should go. You cannot own rain that fall from sky or stream that run to sacred places. The philosophical divide revealed in that exchange went to the heart of every conflict between indigenous peoples and European settlers throughout the Americas, touching on fundamental questions about the relationship between humans and the natural world that could not be resolved through legal arguments or official authority. But Crawford had not ridden this far with this many men to engage in debates about land ownership, philosophy, or water rights theology. His next words revealed the true nature of this confrontation and the forces that were driving it toward violent resolution, regardless of evidence or testimony or appeals to justice. McKinnon, you have 1 minute to turn over these women or face arrest yourself for harboring fugitives and interfering with territorial law enforcement, Crawford announced, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his revolver in a gesture that was meant to be noticed and understood by everyone present. I have legal authority to use whatever force proves necessary to execute these warrants. The ultimatum represented the moment when this stopped being about legal process and became about power exercised through threat of violence, the point at which official authority revealed itself as nothing more than organized force applied on behalf of those with sufficient resources to purchase whatever outcomes they desired. Ezra felt the familiar weight of decisions settling on his shoulders, heavier this time because he knew that whatever choice he made would determine not just the immediate fate of 2 Apache women, but the kind of man he would be for whatever years remained to him. Behind him stood Dr. Morrison, a professional who had risked his career to testify for truth. Beside him stood Ayanna and Sakari, 2 women whose only crime was existing in a place where their presence was inconvenient for powerful interests. His long exile had taught him that safety came from avoiding exactly this kind of moral complexity, that peace could be found by refusing to care about anything beyond his own immediate survival. But standing here with Crawford's ultimatum hanging in the air like a noose, Ezra realized that some kinds of safety were indistinguishable from death, that some forms of peace were achieved only by surrendering everything that made life worth living. Sheriff, Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying the steady tone of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "I've listened to your accusations and examined your evidence and heard testimony from a medical professional about irregularities that call into question the entire foundation of your case. Based on what I've learned tonight, I'm not convinced these women have committed any crime beyond the offense of being Apache in territory where some people would prefer they didn't exist." Crawford's expression hardened with the realization that intimidation and legal authority were not going to resolve this situation according to his preferred timeline, that he was facing genuine resistance from people who had chosen principle over prudence, regardless of personal cost. "That's your final answer?" Crawford asked, his voice carrying the weight of last chance before consequences became unavoidable. "It is," Ezra replied, stepping slightly forward to place himself more clearly between the mounted lawmen and the women they had come to arrest. "These people are under my protection as guests on my property, and I'll not see them handed over to face charges based on fabricated evidence and manufactured testimony." The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to breaking point, tension building until the very air seemed to vibrate with possibility and threat. Crawford's hand moved closer to his weapon, his men shifting in their saddles with the readiness of professionals prepared for violence. The entire confrontation balanced on the edge of gunfire that would settle nothing but might destroy everything. But before anyone could draw a weapon or make the irrevocable move toward violent resolution, the sound of approaching horses reached them from an unexpected direction. Not from town, where reinforcements might have been summoned, but from the north, where the territorial road connected to other settlements and other sources of authority that might complicate Crawford's carefully planned operation. The new arrivals numbered 6 riders, led by a man whose bearing and dress marked him immediately as someone with significant authority and the confidence that came from wielding it effectively. As they drew closer, lamplight revealed the face of Judge Harrison himself, the territorial magistrate whose signature supposedly authorized the warrants Crawford carried, accompanied by 5 men whose professional appearance suggested they represented interests more powerful than local politics or regional corruption. Crawford's confident demeanor cracked visibly as he recognized the judge, his calculation of odds and outcomes suddenly complicated by the presence of someone whose authority exceeded his own and whose approval would be necessary for any violent resolution of this confrontation. Judge Harrison's unexpected appearance suggested that word of tonight's events had reached sources that Crawford had not anticipated, creating complications that could extend far beyond this isolated confrontation. "Sheriff Crawford," Judge Harrison called out as his group approached, his voice carrying the formal authority of territorial judiciary backed by federal appointment. "I understand there's been some confusion about warrants allegedly issued under my authority for the arrest of Apache women on theft charges." The words struck Crawford like a physical blow, revealing that whatever game he had been playing was about to be exposed and examined by authorities with the power to hold him accountable for his actions. His response carried the desperate tone of someone trying to salvage a deteriorating situation through quick thinking and careful word choice. "Judge Harrison, I have properly executed warrants bearing your signature for the arrest of these women on charges filed by Mr. Brennan regarding theft of livestock and grain from his property," Crawford said, producing the documents he had displayed earlier, but this time holding them with less confidence and more obvious reluctance to submit them for close examination. Harrison dismounted with the deliberate care of an older man whose authority derived from wisdom and experience rather than physical strength. But his movements carried the confidence of someone who had faced down corruption and dishonesty throughout a long career in territorial service. When he spoke, his words cut through Crawford's attempted explanation with surgical precision. "Sheriff, I issued no such warrants," Harrison said clearly, his voice carrying across the assembled group with absolute authority. "I've been in Santa Fe for the past week attending territorial legal conferences, and no requests for arrest warrants regarding Apache women have crossed my desk for review or signature." The silence that followed this revelation was more devastating than any gunshot, destroying the entire legal foundation for Crawford's presence and authority with a simple statement of fact that could be verified through territorial records and judicial schedules. Crawford's face went through several shades of confusion and growing panic as he realized that whatever documents he carried were either forgeries or had been issued by someone without proper authority to do so. "But sir," Crawford stammered, his professional confidence collapsing under the weight of exposure. Mr. Brennan filed formal complaints and provided evidence of theft that seemed to justify immediate action to prevent the suspects from fleeing territorial jurisdiction. Mr. Crawford, Harrison said with the patient tone of someone explaining basic legal principles to someone who should already understand them, arrest warrants cannot be issued without judicial review, and judicial review cannot occur when the judge is absent from his jurisdiction. Any documents you possess claiming my authority for these arrests are either forgeries or were issued by someone acting without proper legal standing. The implications were staggering. If Crawford had been operating under false authority, then everything he had done tonight constituted kidnapping, assault, and possibly conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights under color of law. The federal charges alone could result in decades of imprisonment, while the territorial charges could end careers and destroy reputations throughout the entire regional law enforcement community. But Judge Harrison was not finished with his devastating analysis of the situation. His next words revealed the true scope of the investigation that had brought him here tonight and the interests that had been mobilized to ensure that justice prevailed over corruption and private manipulation of public authority. Furthermore, Harrison continued, I've spent the past 3 days reviewing territorial records regarding complaints filed against Apache families in this region, and I've discovered a disturbing pattern of accusations that follow identical procedures, rely on similar types of evidence, and consistently result in families abandoning their traditional territories rather than facing trial in territorial courts. The systematic nature of the corruption was being exposed in real time, revealing a conspiracy that reached beyond individual cases into patterns of behavior that suggested organized effort to remove Apache families from lands that powerful interests wanted to control. Harrison's investigation had apparently uncovered evidence that transformed isolated incidents into something far more serious and federally actionable. Judge Dr. Morrison said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone whose professional testimony would be crucial to any formal investigation. I have medical evidence that supports your findings. Items presented as stolen property contain materials I can prove were never in Mr. Brennan's possession, suggesting deliberate fabrication of evidence to support false accusations. Harrison turned his attention to the doctor with the focused intensity of someone who understood that expert testimony from respected professionals could provide the foundation for criminal charges that would survive appellate review and federal scrutiny. Dr. Morrison, would you be prepared to provide sworn testimony regarding your findings? Absolutely, Morrison replied without hesitation, his earlier fear completely replaced by determination to see justice done regardless of personal cost. I have detailed records of my sales to various customers, including fabric that appears in alleged stolen clothing and cookware that matches items supposedly taken from Mr. Brennan's property. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come, delivered by one of the men who had accompanied Judge Harrison and whose professional bearing suggested federal rather than territorial authority. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of investigation that had been proceeding for months rather than days, revealing the true scope of the forces that had been mobilized to address systematic corruption in Arizona territorial law enforcement. Mr. Brennan, the federal agent said, his voice carrying official authority backed by resources that exceeded anything available at the territorial level. I'm Special Agent Marcus Webb with the Department of Justice, and I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights under color of law, mail fraud in connection with false territorial filings, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping and assault. The words hit the assembled group like artillery fire, transforming what had been a local dispute into a federal criminal case with implications that reached far beyond Arizona territory into questions of civil rights and constitutional protections that were being tested and defined throughout the post-war American legal system. Brennan's response revealed the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed empire was collapsing in real time, whose political connections and economic power were proving insufficient to protect him from federal investigation and criminal prosecution. His voice cracked with panic as he attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of his position. "This is ridiculous," Brennan protested, his earlier confidence completely gone. "These are legitimate business practices and proper use of territorial legal processes to protect private property rights from theft and trespassing by hostile elements. Mr. Brennan, Agent Webb replied calmly, our investigation has documented systematic false reporting, fabrication of evidence, and coordination with corrupt territorial officials to deprive Apache families of legal protections guaranteed under federal treaties and constitutional provisions. This goes far beyond property disputes into criminal conspiracy that violates multiple federal statutes. The scope of the federal case was becoming clear, revealing investigation that had been proceeding for months and had apparently gathered sufficient evidence to support charges that could result in decades of federal imprisonment. Webb's presence tonight suggested that this confrontation had been anticipated and that federal authorities had been prepared to intervene if local resolution proved impossible. Crawford's situation was becoming more desperate by the moment, his realization growing that he had been used by Brennan as a tool in a conspiracy that was far larger and more dangerous than he had understood when he agreed to participate. His next words revealed the panic of someone who was beginning to understand the federal charges that might be filed against him. Agent Webb, Crawford said, his voice shaking with growing fear, I was acting on what I believed to be properly issued territorial warrants. If there were irregularities in the documentation, I was not aware of them and did not participate in any conspiracy to fabricate evidence or violate anyone's civil rights. Webb's response revealed the thoroughness of the federal investigation and the quality of evidence that had been gathered to support criminal charges against everyone involved in the conspiracy. Sheriff Crawford, our investigation includes recorded communications between you and Mr. Brennan discussing strategies for removing Apache families from territorial lands through false accusations and manufactured evidence. Your participation was not passive or unknowing. The revelation that federal agents had been monitoring communications between the conspirators added another layer to the criminal exposure facing everyone who had participated in the systematic persecution of Apache families. Crawford's face went white as he realized that his conversations with Brennan had been documented and could be used to support federal charges that would end his career and his freedom. But the most important moment came when Judge Harrison turned his attention to Ayanna and Sakari, his bearing shifting from judicial authority to something approaching personal apology for the failures of the legal system he represented. Miss Ayanna, Miss Sakari, Harrison said formally, on behalf of the Arizona Territory and the United States government, I apologize for the harassment and false accusations you have endured. You are free to remain on Mr. McKinnon's property or travel wherever you choose without fear of legal harassment based on these fabricated charges. The formal exoneration carried weight that went beyond simple dismissal of charges, representing official recognition that they had been victims of systematic persecution rather than perpetrators of criminal activity. But more than that, it represented acknowledgement by territorial authority that Apache families deserve the same legal protections as any other residents of federal territories. Agent Webb added his own official statement that carried even greater significance for the future. Furthermore, the Department of Justice will be conducting a comprehensive review of all similar cases throughout Arizona Territory, and we will be working with territorial authorities to ensure that Apache families receive full protection of federal civil rights guarantees. The promise of systematic reform represented the kind of change that could transform life for Apache families throughout the territory, creating legal protections that would prevent future persecution and provide recourse when local authorities failed to protect constitutional rights. As the federal agents took Brennan and Crawford into custody, their departure marked the end of more than just one evening's confrontation. It represented the collapse of a system of corruption that had operated with impunity for years and the beginning of a new era in which federal authority would be used to protect rather than persecute Apache families. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Law enforcement officers who had arrived to arrest innocent people departing as prisoners themselves. Their authority exposed as fraud and their power revealed as nothing more than organized criminality disguised as legal process. As the last of the horses disappeared into the desert darkness, Ezra found himself standing on his porch with Ayanna, Sakari, and Dr. Morrison, four people who had chosen principle over prudence and discovered that sometimes courage was rewarded rather than punished, that sometimes justice prevailed over corruption and power. The silence that settled over his property felt different from the emptiness he had known for 8 years, charged with possibility rather than haunted by loss. filled with the potential for connection rather than the echo of isolation. For the first time since Catherine and Mary died, Ezra McKinnon felt that the future might hold something worth working toward rather than simply enduring. 3 days after the federal agents departed with their prisoners, the real work began. Building trust was harder than exposing corruption, and Ezra knew that changing hearts would prove more challenging than changing laws. Not all settlers welcomed the new arrangements. Frank Morrison, no relation to the doctor, posted notices around town claiming Apache privileges threatened white settlers' rights. The saloons still buzzed with grumbling about federal interference and special treatment for savages. But change was taking root nonetheless, one small act at a time. That afternoon, Jacob Martinez arrived at the cabin. 19 years old and fresh from territorial law school, he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned early that his mixed Apache and Mexican heritage made him unwelcome in many places. His letter of appointment as Ezra's deputy bore Judge Harrison's official seal. "Mr. McKinnon," Jacob said, removing his hat respectfully, "I've studied what happened here, how you chose principle over safety when it would have been easier to look away. I want to learn that kind of courage." Ezra studied the young man's earnest face, recognizing the same mixture of idealism and uncertainty he had once carried into war. "Son, real courage isn't about being fearless. It's about understanding that some things matter more than your own comfort, when you know the cost of doing nothing exceeds the price of taking action." "But how do you recognize those moments?" Jacob pressed. "When you see someone who can't protect themselves being destroyed by those who can," Ezra replied. "When you realize that staying silent makes you complicit in their suffering." Ayanna approached from the garden, wiping dirt from her hands. "Young deputy," she said with approval, "you ask good questions, questions my father would have respected." That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert, Ezra found himself at Catherine and Mary's graves for the first time since the night everything changed. He had avoided this place during his years of numbness, afraid that facing their memory would break what little control he had maintained. Now he came not in desperation, but in gratitude. "I found my way back to something worth fighting for," he said quietly to the stones. "Not to who I was before we lost each other, but to who your love always meant me to be. I hope you'd approve of the man I'm becoming." A gentle breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves above their resting place, and Ezra chose to hear it as approval. When he returned to the porch, Jacob was listening intently as Sakari explained the medicinal properties of desert plants to 3 children whose parents had once forbidden such conversations. Ayanna sat beside them, her imposing frame relaxed as she demonstrated how to weave grass into rope strong enough to hold a horse. "This is how change really happens," she observed as Ezra settled into his chair. "Not in courtrooms or government offices, but in moments when people choose to see each other as human beings deserving of respect." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, each point of light a reminder that even in the vastest darkness, illumination was possible. For a man who had spent nearly a decade believing that isolation was safety, the discovery that connection could be strength felt like witnessing the birth of constellations. The work ahead would be measured in years rather than months. Progress counted in small victories rather than grand gestures. But for the first time since grief had defined his world, Ezra McKinnon felt eager to meet whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, knowing that he would not face them alone. The desert nights settled around them like a blessing, promising that even in the harshest country, communities could grow where courage took root and justice found fertile ground.